Hello everyone, and welcome to the video that will attempt to give you the workshop that I was having in conjunction with the library and CETL on teaching tips for documentation. So I am Cheryl Duffus, I'm the QEP director, and let's see, I would like to get on over to Blackboard so that you don't have to watch me anymore. So what I'm looking at right here is in the QEP Writing Connection Blackboard org. If you're watching this video, then you found it. It's also going to be housed under the CETL tab under their Teaching Blackboard org so that everyone will have access to it. So today I'm going to start out with a PowerPoint, and then I've got some other documents that I'm using as supporting information. Something that I would like to share first is this first document here, the English 102 Units of Study. And these are our common units of study in the English department. These are the things that we all do in English 102. So we may have different themes and topics that the students are researching, but they do all do the same types of assignments. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that research and documentation is a part of English 102. They visit the library 2 times to learn research strategies. As you can see here in this synthesis assignment, it is supposed to be evaluating sources, so evaluating research, and with the purpose of using that research to support an academic argument. So if you want to refresh students' memories as to what they learned in English 102 and also to hold them accountable for remembering those skills and with connecting them to your class, you could just take a look at this document and see, well, where do my assignments and what I'm covering in class connect with what students have already learned? And this can help with the transfer of learning and with making their education a more enriching experience. If you scroll on down, you can see that our SLOs and course objectives and all that stuff are in here as well. You can also see under the SLOs that they are supposed to learn to compose an argument that demonstrates knowledge of argument structure and conventions. Again, we're teaching them sort of generic argumentation styles. We're not teaching them an argumentation style that's specific to a discipline. So if there is something about your discipline that it does that's unique to it, then you would need to add on to that. But I think you could expect that students would understand, you have to have a thesis statement. You have to have logos information to support your argument. So logic, research, facts, evidence, expert opinion, that sort of thing. You can also see that they're supposed to demonstrate effective research skills. Again, they go to the library twice with help in finding and evaluating sources. And they also, number 7, they're supposed to synthesize sources in their writing. So that would include things like paraphrasing and quoting. Again, you can remind students that these are things that they have had before. And we teach MLA documentation. It's possible some English 102 instructors might also introduce students to APA or perhaps to Turabian, but we are not required to. So you'll want to keep that in mind, that we've introduced them to MLA. I would not consider English 102 students to be masters of MLA. Some of them might be more proficient than others, but I would say that most of them struggle with learning to do it correctly. And if you are going to be teaching them or using a different documentation style, you're going to want to keep in mind that they are all different and that the students are going to have to learn the differences between them. So that's just to sort of let y'all know that building on those connections between classes can be very helpful for students. And again, I'm a big proponent of holding students accountable and reminding them of what they have already learned. All right, sometimes they think, oh, that class is over, I can just hit the flush button in my brain and there it goes. All right, so here's my little PowerPoint. So I like to remind everybody that this stuff about research, documentation, etc., this is part of our QEP Writing Intensive SLOs. So if you're teaching a writing intensive class, this is supposed to be part of the class and part of the writing assignment, the QEP writing assignment. So it's right down here in number 4. We're not going to talk about everything in this SLO today we're going to talk about documentation. Part of what has spurred these teaching demonstrations on documentation, or on the tips for teaching documentation, is that consistently over the past 3 semesters, students have been scoring very low on their proficiency with documentation on the QEP rubric. So obviously this is a problem that faculty are identifying. I also like to remind students that SLO 4 is actually really connected to the other SLOs. So if we go back, previous. If we go back, you can see that doing research is part of the writing process. When I am teaching argument, it's really hard to write an argument about something you don't know anything about. So you have to do the research first. And I think that's true for a lot of classes. You have to do something first to write about it. Maybe you have to do an experiment. Maybe you have to observe someone in a classroom. But a lot of times you have to do something before you can actually write about it. Let's see, with context and purpose and being appropriate, that has to do with using documentation for a formal academic environment. Students aren't writing social media, at least for this class. And so part of that context and purpose, part of signaling to your audience that you are writing a serious academic paper, is a good control over your documentation and formatting. And oftentimes documentation can be very much a part of the discipline and of the style of writing. I know that APA is very heavily connected. It's not to the style of writing. It's not just how you do your bibliography or how you do your in-text cites. It has to do with the very way you structure the paper, the order of information in the paper, the style of voice that you use. It's very formal. Personal stuff is not allowed. It's sometimes lots of passive voice is used. So I think getting students to see that documentation isn't just about us being mean and having a bunch of ridiculous rules, that it's about learning to write appropriately for a context, that it's learning how to use information in a respectful, appropriate way, and it's all about being part of the discipline. And that if you go into psychology, people expect that you understand how APA works, that you can write in that style, and that you can analyze something in that style. Alrighty. So also just another reminder of some good practices when talking about writing is if we could all start to use similar vocabulary with students, that will help them with this transfer of knowledge and learning. So, and these are the same words that the librarians would use in any instructional sessions that they do with your students. So we like to talk about evaluating sources. This is reading carefully, taking notes on sources, taking them apart and looking at how they work, anything like that. Looking at the reliability and appropriateness of sources. So yes, that a source is both reliable and appropriate to the topic and appropriate to the project the student is working on. If they're working on something for English 102, I don't expect them to be super specialists. But if it was a similar topic, like one of my students right now is looking at, is there a genetic cause to Alzheimer's? But if she was doing this for like biology 491 or something, I'm sure the expectations would be much, 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 much higher than I have for her in English 102, where I'm like, I'm not really worried about you being a scientific expert. I'm just worried about you, using the library and documentation. Integrating others' ideas with our own, that's heavily to do with documentation, and we're going to talk about that today, and obviously documenting research correctly. So I think something that can help before you even get started in documenting research is if we help our students evaluate research well. So I think that it's good to help students understand that research isn't busy work. I think oftentimes students, they're like, I know what I want to write. I already know everything about this, and I'm just going to slap in some sources and quotes because the teacher told me to. But helping them to understand their discipline and how academic research works is you have a question about a topic, or you think you're interested in a topic, but what do other people say? What do other scholars say? What work has already been done in this field? Because you're not just this lone voice in the desert, you're trying to show students how they are part of the discourse around a certain topic. So research can help students broaden their ideas. It can help them think in new ways. It can help show that maybe what they were thinking of has been done to death and they need to go in a new direction. It can show them how their ideas can change. So I think we can present research as something that's very kind of exciting and vital, and it's not just busy work and throwing quotes into papers and having a list of URLs at the end of the paper. So you can engage students in activities that will hold them accountable for evaluating their research and will help see if they can make sense of it. And so I've got a list right here, and some of them are going to be very familiar, some of them may not. So you can do traditional activities, and I do these things with my upperclassmen and English majors. Annotated bibliographies are a good way to have a quick check-in and see if students are reading and understanding sources. Literature reviews are really good to have students write when they get to the end of doing a body of research, because it helps them paint the big picture of the research around a topic and draw connections and show the growth and change of ideas over time. You can also do something more informal. You could have students write a dialogue. It could be a dialogue between themselves and a source, so them asking a source questions and the source answering it. It could also be a dialogue between two sources, especially if you're having them look at opposing opinions on a particular question. You can also have them do a double entry journal, and that is, they can do this on a computer or they can do this on paper. And basically they divide the paper in half. And so you can, draw a line long ways, like a hot dog bun down the middle, and then a line across the top. And I believe Jerry Gilsdorf calls this a T-chart when he uses double entry journals. And on one side, usually the left side, students take notes on the source. So they're writing down important ideas from the source, quotes, facts, statistics, whatever. Hopefully, I remind them, put the page number next to their notes. It'll make it easier later. And then on the other side of the page, that's where they are analyzing and evaluating the research. So however you want them to analyze and evaluate the research. So how is this research helping them understand the topic? How is this research challenging them? What do they not understand? What do they have questions about? Like, let's say they're writing an argument for my English 102 class. I would ask them, well, what part of the argument is this source helping you with? Is it helping you with the logical, factual information? Is it providing an opposing point of view? Is it background information? I mean, just anything where you're getting them to evaluate and engage with the source. And you can even double it or push it onto the next page where you might leave comments if you read it. I don't read these things very carefully because it's very time consuming. I will look at them to make sure that students are doing them. Or you could have a classmate reacting and making notes regarding what the student is doing. So this is the basic concept, and you can really adapt it to your own purposes. As a form of this is also in an assignment called What It Says and What It Does. And that's where on one side of the page, the student would take an essay. This is what it says. This is what paragraph 1 says. And this is what it does. And this gets them to break down the source into its parts. Okay, this is an introduction. If it's something like APA, okay, they're going to have to explain their methodology. They're going to have to explain their research process. They're going to have their results. So getting them to look at the writing and describing or summarizing it, which is a lower level skill, and then being able to say, well, what is this writing doing? What is the purpose of this paragraph in this essay? Then they can also do another variation of the dialogue. The source says this, I say that. That's where you can get them to learn to play devil's advocate and to see more than one point of view. And then another version of this is they could read a source and be, oh, I'm the believer, I'm the cheerleader for this point of view, or I'm the doubter. I'm going to find problems and counter arguments and holes in this person's argument. So those are different things you can do to help them engage with sources. And I would say do whatever is comfortable for you. You may be more comfortable with something like annotated bibs. You may hate annotated bibs and want to do something more creative. I mean, there's really no right or wrong. I wouldn't recommend doing all these things or your students will be exhausted, and you'll be exhausted too. With these types of things, usually, like I said, I don't grade double entry journals. I just kind of look at them to make sure students are doing them. And really, they quickly see that if they do them, there's a payoff. Life is easier. And you can tell them that. This stuff's a lot of work and it's a pain in the neck, but it pays off later. I do grade things like annotated bids and literature reviews. I think visual strategies for getting students to evaluate research are really, really helpful. You can do this as a concept map, and I'm going to get out of this right here so I can show you a concept map. And oh, wrong one. And I have this up on the org. So you might be familiar with concept maps, and this is one in a PowerPoint, but students can do this by hand. I don't expect my students to be graphic designers because I don't teach that class. So in the middle of the concept map, and they can do it with squares or circles, whatever makes them happy, that's where they need to put their topic, the question, the argument, whatever that they are researching. So you can see in the middle of this concept map, this person, the student, was looking at sanitation in the medical field. They were worried about problems with unsanitary conditions in hospitals. And then what I have them do is, you see in yellow right here around, those are the different sources that this student found. Now this was for an English 102 class. I don't teach nursing. And I only made them find 5 sources. Again, if this was an upper level class, you might want them to find many, many more sources. And the concept map can be expanded. Then I make them do something where they kind of give a short summary of the source, and that's in blue here. And then in the black type, I make them show connections between sources and how the source is connected to the overall research topic. So something like a double entry journal or an annotated bib, that is kind of a close-up of one source. I like the concept map because it's kind of a broad view or the big picture of all their research. So what are all these sources? How do they fit together? Which ones are alike? Which ones are not alike? And how do they all connect back to the topic? And this can be a very eye-opening experience for students. In my senior, or it's not my class, in the English department's thesis class, senior thesis class, which I'm teaching right now, we have them find, I think it's 35 sources. And I'll make them do 3 different concept maps. And that just, it really gets them to see that, oh, okay, here's the big field of what it is I'm looking at. And if you have students do a lit review, doing something like a concept map ahead of time can get them to see those connections visually that might be hard for them to do in words. I would say most people are very visual. They're visual learners. I'm not. I'm in a minority. So I look at a concept map and it's a challenge. But I've had very positive feedback about these concept maps, both from freshmen and from junior and senior English majors. So they can just be really kind of big game changers with research. And doing all of these things, and concept maps are very quick to grade. I mean, either all the components are there or they aren't. So, you know, it's a very quick grade, but the payoff is huge for students. And for me, if you have them do these things and you're keeping them accountable for their work, then it's just much easier to teach them things like quoting and paraphrasing and signal phrases because they've actually read the sources. So that's why I took up your time there with that. Okay. So other things that you can use that help students, mentor texts. You might find a published scholarly article that you think would be a good model for students. Now, not all published work is going to follow the documentation style you use, so you got to be careful. But especially if you were using APA format, that might really get students to see how the formatting, how it works, the different subheadings and the different sections of an APA paper, how an abstract works, all of those things. If you have some sample student essays, I only show positive examples of student essays because they might not remember which ones are positive or they might not pay attention. And I don't want anyone modeling inaccurate work. I try to take student names off just so students don't feel put on the spot. Other things you can use to help you help reinforce documentation. There's a Writing Fellows program. You can get in touch with me about having a writing fellow in your class. This is a peer tutor who meets one-on-one with your students outside of class. I will say they were, I observed recently 2 writing fellows with majors classes where the students were using APA for the first time, and it was a huge struggle for the students. And the writing fellows were really helpful and patient with getting them to see what they needed to do, and you know, they would encounter situations where the students were writing personal narrative or using I, which is inappropriate to APA. And they would have, more friendly conversations about why you couldn't do that and so forth. You can also use writing conferences and instructor feedback for documentation, and I'm going to talk about some strategies for instructor feedback. Again, I would recommend keeping these things 10-minute time span, maybe 15. Don't let them take over your life, and don't let feedback take over your life. You can also have students work in groups, and I'm going to have some examples of things that they could do in groups. So you've got lots of opportunities for giving students model and with giving them interactive feedback, because that is what they need to help learn documentation. So a big question is, of course, what documentation style are you using and how do you help students use it? I highly recommend that you, if your department doesn't require it, my department requires MLA. If they didn't, I might use Trabian because I like Trabian. But anyway, so if you're not required to use a certain documentation style, it can be confusing and ineffective to tell your students to just pick a style, because they may pick something that they think they know, but they don't really know. Or they may pick something and get confused. And then I certainly wouldn't want to be in the situation where I was having to grade 2 or 3 different documentation styles. That just seems like a huge pain in the neck. So I would recommend, pick the documentation style that best suits your discipline or that your department requires you to use. And then you can help students to use it and to get them to see that this is part of the discipline. And truly, when we tell them that it doesn't matter which documentation style they use, then if you're in a discipline, it probably really does matter. Like, I couldn't use APA for English. That would be silly. So the reason why I'm telling you that you need to do all this modeling and interactive feedback is that lecturing about documentation does not work. I've been doing this for 20 years now. It is completely ineffective. Students stop listening in less than 1 minute because it's boring. What you have to do is you have to give students activities that requires them to work, or I guess the nice word is engage. I really enjoy watching students work because I'm getting old and I like watching young people work. So, but it's really good for their learning because they have to actually be doing it. I mean, if you think about it, documentation, it's something we do. It's not something that someone wants to listen to a lecture about, and I don't enjoy lecturing about documentation. So I think it can be a good idea to give them some tasks to do. So I'm going to show you just some different tasks that you can do with students. So you can give a brief overview of a documentation style. And by brief, I mean less than 5 minutes. And one thing I think would be helpful when you first start talking about documentation is just to make sure they understand the words that you're using, because they may misremember. They may be completely wrong. They may have been told something wrong. So make sure that you're all on the same page. Here I've got some MLA terminology. It may not be exactly the same for the documentation style you use, but I know you can just substitute words. So I'll write words on the board like paraphrase, direct quotation, summary, and then I'll ask them to get in small groups and to come up with definitions for these. And it can be very shocking what they come up with. Sometimes most students do not understand what a paraphrase is. They think that if you take a quote and change 1 or 2 words, it's a paraphrase. No. You have to change everything, and it has to be in your style and your voice, etc. So, and similarly, they may think a direct quotation, they may just have no clue, and they probably have never even heard the term summary. So I would say it's a good opportunity to make sure that they understand these words and that you're all on the same page. Also, to make sure that they understand any key words around how you are supposed to integrate sources into your own writing. So I know with MLA and APA, there's in-text citations or parenthetical citations. With Trabian and Chicago, one uses footnotes, sometimes endnotes, or both. So it's good to make sure that they actually understand what these things are and what is appropriate. It's a term that's very important in MLA is a signal phrase, and that's just making sure that all quotes have introductions. So the first time you use an author, introduce this person and their work, or make sure that a quote is actually integrated into what you're writing. You introduce it, you're explaining why you're using this quote, and everything fits in there. I say this because 2 years ago, when I first started doing all this stuff in my English 102 class, the students actually told me that this was the first time they had ever read their sources, which just kind of makes you want to cry. But in the past, they literally really would just, they'd pick 5 sources and they would be on their works cited page, but they would just kind of throw quotes in. So if you're reading something and you feel like students are throwing quotes in, that's because they are. You're not crazy. All right, so another thing you can do after you get all those key terms defined is you can get them to practice doing the key terms. So I would say either provide an example from a published text, or you can get them to look at an example of a published text or a student work and get them to identify where the writer is paraphrasing or summarizing and where the writer might be directly quoting. And if you can just get them to do that, then that's a huge step, and they can see the difference between a paraphrase and a direct quote. You can have them look at how a paraphrase is completely in the writer's style and vocabulary, whereas a direct quote is different. If you want to, if you think your students are ready for a more advanced discussion, you could get them to talk about, well, why do you think the writer used a paraphrase instead of a quote, or vice versa? So that's something that, another exercise that they could do to make sure that you're kind of reinforcing the difference between paraphrasing and quoting. You can also ask them to find an in-text citation in this sample work and then try to find the source on the works cited page. For this, I think it's effective if you can find a source that's got like 30, you can find an example that's got like 30 sources on the works cited page, because then they see why alphabetization is important. We only have like 5 sources. It's not that hard to find them. But if you have 30 or more, and if you aren't alphabetizing, then it's impossible to find the source. And it's a pain, and you're not being nice to your reader. So I think this helps them to see how doing things like alphabetizing, to them they may perceive this as trivial or unimportant, but it's actually helping your reader. And it's creating good ethos for you as a writer. And alphabetizing is kind of a life skill. So there you go. You can also have them identify signal phrases if that's something that's important to you. And you can talk about how signal phrases not only helps people see why the quote is in or the paraphrase is in here, but it creates transitions, it introduces ideas, it creates the feeling of flow, which is something students constantly say they're worried about. Does their writing flow? Well, here's something they can do to help it. And also you can have them look at the quotes. Are they fitting into the flow of ideas in the paragraph? They're not random quotes that are just thrown in there. And you can also have a discussion about how using this research and citing it and having a good works cited page, this creates very strong logos and ethos for the writer. You're showing that you are a reliable, credible, ethical writer. You're not just making stuff up. All right, something else you can do is you can have them bring at least one of their sources that they found to class, and then have them pick a couple sources from the source, and you can lead them through an exercise where they write a summary of the paragraphs, where they are quoting and citing, where they're paraphrasing and citing, and you can walk around and help students. This does not have to take up the whole class time, and I don't think any of these things should take up the whole class time. And depending upon your students, I mean, you may need 5 minutes, you may need 15 minutes. It really just depends. But I think walking around and looking at what students are doing is very enlightening. And you really have to kind of get in their faces, because there's always the student who is afraid of being wrong, or afraid of showing weakness because they're afraid that you're going to think they're stupid. Sometimes you have to kind of poke your head in their business and ask to see their computer screen or their piece of paper. So you walk around and look at what they're doing and correct what's wrong. And I have literally had students tell me that they never really understood how to do any of this until that day. So, this can be a real gift to students. So you can walk around and help them. You could also assign this as out-of-class work and have them submit it as a discussion board or a journal assignment. These are things that are very quick to grade. These aren't the kinds of things that I would grade for ABC. I would grade them for participation, and then if they're correct or incorrect, make students go back and fix them. So this, I think, can be very helpful. I do this with all levels of students. Sometimes we think, oh, I did this with students in English 102. Why do I have to do it with them their senior year? But it takes a long time to learn this stuff, a really long time. And you just have to keep reinforcing it. So, and then you don't know what's happened to them I don't know what's happened to them between English 102 and when they have me the next time. All right, something else you can do is you can give them, and this helps if they have laptops or if you're in a computer lab, you can give them the actual electronic file of an unformatted document. And then you can give them a resource, some kind of thing that has guidelines for correctly formatting a document. And this could be Purdue OWL or whatever you want to use. Our library has tons of great resources for documentation. And then you could just ask them to format the document correctly. They could also do this in small groups. Again, you can walk around and help with what they're struggling with. They could all have different documents, and then they upload them to a discussion board or a Google Doc or something like that where you can look at them. You could also all give them the same document if it's a really small class. I have a class with 3 students now. It's a senior thesis class. Don't worry, it's what a prorated overload. I had all 3 students just kind of work on the same document that's up on Google Drive, and you can also use OneDrive through our university. And it was up on the screen, and I was on it too, and I would ask them things. How do you do the double spacing? How do you do that last name page number up in the top? How do you get that in there? How do you do a running header if it's APA? Because a lot of times students don't know how to do these things in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever it is they're using. We have, because they're so proficient at technology like smartphones and apps and social media, we think they have the same proficiencies with Microsoft Word or Excel, and they don't. And I was thinking about it the other day. I've been using Microsoft Word for over half my life, which is frightening. So I should have more proficiency than people who've been using it for far less time. So I think anything you can do like this that's very interactive, and even if you're all in the same Google Doc, that can be a lot of fun. And I had a ton of fun doing this with my students. I thought it was really neat. And they got to laugh at each other about what they could and could not do. I would highly recommend that you use the AutoCites from the library's databases, or that you recommend that students use the AutoCites from the library's databases. You do have to remind them which documentation style to select. And so I'm going to go over to the library here. I'm sorry, I should have had this up. But this is going to be super quick as long as the internet's working. So go to the library, and I'm going to look at databases by title. Come on. And I'm going to look at I think, no, MLA is probably a better one. I'm going to look at MLA because I'm a literature person, and it's an EBSCOhost database, so this might look familiar to you. And I'm just going to put Jane Eyre. Why not? I don't do anything with Jane Eyre, but that just sort of came to mind. And you can pick any old source you want here. And if you just go in, there's something in all these databases where you can cite. Either the word cite will appear, or sometimes you just see quotation marks. It varies from database to database. And then you have to pick which citation format. So obviously I don't want them picking something, whatever this is Brazilian. We don't live in Brazil. This is not American Medical Association. So they've got to scroll down and pick MLA. Here it is. And sometimes the database sites will say different editions, earlier editions. You just want to make sure that it's the correct edition. So they go in here, they can copy this and paste it into their own document. This gets them about 90% of the way there. And you can, here's Chicago Turabian, and APA is up here. So you can see that this is most of the way there. APA is actually pretty good. And back down here to MLA and Chicago is most of the way there. Now for MLA, this has to be double spaced. And they need to make sure this is not probably the font that they're using in their paper. MLA is really super picky about everything looking the same. So you need to make sure it's the same font. It's not a weird bolding or anything. It's the same size font, the double spacing, the hanging indent. So what you can do is you tell them to use these things. They're there. It gets you 90% of the way there. And they can, you can do the same thing with Google Docs. Open a common Google Doc that you share with everyone and have everybody copy some AutoCites into it, and then lead them through these steps to correctly format it. So the hanging indent, they have no idea how to do this. So you can show them how to do it, get them to do it. Once they actually do it, they're more likely to remember because they're creating that muscle memory or whatever. There are videos in YouTube about how to do a hanging indent. There are also videos. Purdue OWL has a YouTube station, and they'll show you how to do these things. The library has videos on how to do a hanging indent and other kinds of formatting things. So you can also link to those resources. And for me, I have to do something on a computer. I can't just watch someone else do it because I'll never remember it, not in a million years. I have to do it myself. So that's why these hands-on things are really important. You can also show them how to get rid of that HTML formatting if you have any kind of URL, or maybe, I don't think the DOI has that formatting, but you can show them how to get rid of that. You can show them how to do all kinds of things that we think are just common sense, but really it's because, sadly, we've been working with Microsoft Word for over half our lives, and we know how to do this. Yeah, so those are fun things to do. Again, I've done this with my freshmen. I've done this with juniors and seniors, and they all need it. Let's see, and then, you know, you could have them, if it's a small class, like this 3-person class, you could all do it together. If it's a big class, you could have them work in groups of 3, and then, you know, you could have them upload those things to a Blackboard discussion board or wherever, and you could all look at them in the class, and you can identify what's correct and what's incorrect. And that can be a lot of fun too. You can also provide students with a checklist of steps and common mistakes. I have 2 of those up on the org. Let's see, where am I? Yes, here's one, and I have it repeated on the page because I printed out and cut it in half. This is one I give upper class students, juniors and seniors. So I'll tell them these are frequent errors that I see in MLA citations. I'm not going to read all that to you because you can probably do that yourself. Then I also, this is a more extensive checklist that I share with freshmen, and I'd probably give it to any student in a gen ed. So I give them a checklist for the formatting of the document, the formatting of the works cited page and citations, and the in-text citations. This is all fits on one page. Oftentimes I'll print this out on like cardstock, so it's a little bit heavier, with the hope, it could be an illusion, that they might save it, or it might be easier to keep up with. Alrighty. This is something, this is another teaching tip that Jennifer Buckner has shared with our department, is you can take 2 to 5 minutes at the beginning of class to review a type of source, what its citation should look like, and common mistakes. So for, I would say the most common mistake I see in both juniors and seniors and freshmen is that they leave out the name of the database. It's pretty important. So that could just be, you could take 1 minute and go over that at the beginning of class. So kind of mini micro lessons like that can work really well because students don't start to feel annoyed with, I don't know, they think of it as busy work. So that's something you could do that's a really quick thing. Another thing you can do, instead of looking at, you know, a bunch of incorrect citations, you could just do 1 incorrect citation and ask students to correct it. You can even have little contests where you, I don't know, you give students candy if they win or whatever. I mean, you can do all kinds of fun things. And I think studies have shown if you give people chocolate, then they see what they're doing is more positive. So anything you can do. With all of these activities, again, I'm not recommending that anyone let it take over their class. I know you have content that you have to do, and I'm always trying to be aware of that. A lot of these things you can do outside of class. A lot of these things you could use techniques of online and hybrid teaching where you have videos and activities that students do outside of class and that you review quickly, or you maybe even have students review and evaluate each other. Not grade, but maybe evaluate and correct each other. So let's see. What's next here? All right, so let me go back. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, so there's these. These are all just the activities. Yeah, okay. So these are activities you can use, and they hopefully make your students do better and learn. It's a long learning curve. I mean, some students get to the end of English 1 and 2, and it doesn't matter what I do. They just don't get it. They just have not gotten it yet. And everyone learns at a different rate. Everyone learns different skills at a different rate. And I may be frustrated that some student can't do MLA, but Lord, they may know how to code in computer science. So, you know, I try not to judge. Something you can do to create accountability after all these other things either have worked or not worked. If a student turns in something to you and it is just a documentation train wreck, it's possible the student waited to the last minute to do their work. It's possible that it's not important to them. I mean, all kinds of things are possible. But let's say they turn something in and it's a train wreck. I had a student turn in something the other day that was single space and just really antagonized me. You can give this back and tell them it's unacceptable. You can ask them to correct it. You can, if they don't correct it, you can give them a 0. You can be as mean as you want to because it's your class. You can impose a late penalty or penalties for, or very stiff penalties for unacceptable documentation. I mean, if a student turns in a research paper to me and there is no works cited page, that's it. They're going down. I mean, it's just very frustrating when this happens. So I would say have some sort of accountability system with students. Now, I think it is good to have some grace because sometimes, I mean, they're young people, they don't get enough sleep, they're overcommitted, they take too many classes, and they work too much at jobs outside of class. So, you know, you might want to build in some forgiveness. So, for example, asking them to correct the work and resubmit it, that's forgiveness. You could just give them a bad grade and no one's learning anything. I think the point of creating accountability is to hold them accountable for mistakes, but also to help them learn. So yeah. I also highly recommend having a grade deduction for documentation errors or a stiff penalty. I used to grade documentation as part of the rubric, and I could never figure out how to make it harsh enough. I would have students who would be getting like A's and B's and their documentation stunk. So I started doing it as a grade deduction. So they get a grade for content and for fulfilling the requirements of the assignment. So they see that they have that grade, and then they get docked for documentation errors and for writing errors. And that makes them see the effect that these errors have on their grade and also on how they are perceived. And I kind of relate it to how you might dress for a job interview. You might be the greatest person in the world, but if you wear, you know, ratty, dirty clothing to a job interview, no one's going to take you seriously. So that's part of documentation and writing correctly, is that this is, you're dressing, you're writing appropriately for the person you're giving it to. It's part of context. When we go back to the QEP SLOs, you're writing for an academic setting. Of course we expect it to be correct. So I think it's just good to get students to start thinking about what's expected of them and what kind of appearance they're creating and what kind of impression they're making. Because they may never do documentation again after they leave here, but when they go to their job, there's going to be something that they have to do that's appropriate that they think is dumb. But they're going to have to do it because they're going to have to show that they take the job seriously, that they are respectful towards the job, etc. So I always try to connect this stuff to life skills so that, you know, they can have more than one adult in their life nagging them about this stuff. Another possibility for forgiveness is if you impose some grade deduction and everyone starts crying, you could tell them they can make up the points for correcting the work. So that's always a possibility. I actually haven't had anyone start crying, but I love this grade deduction. It really makes people straighten up and fly right. It could take them a while, but eventually they do end up correcting their errors because they just get tired of having the same problem and getting their grade dinged constantly for the same thing. So yeah, oh well, I think I get meaner as I get older. All right, so I highly recommend kind of closing that loop and creating accountability, but also giving students a chance to learn and correct their mistakes. Something else you can do if you have more than one assignment that's using documentation is you can have them write you a cover letter or a reflection letter with the next assignment and have them go back and say, okay, these are my problems with MLA. This is how I corrected them for this assignment. And so that is a little extra incentive for them to learn. And again, it creates accountability because it's not just about punishing people because they make us grumpy, but it's also about helping them to learn to do it better and to not make these mistakes in the future. So my end goal, hopefully, with all of this is that your grading is easier and you're not just weeping as you are grading papers. I would say don't correct work for students because studies have shown that that is meaningless. Wouldn't we all love to have a copy editor just correcting our work? I would say you can mark errors, you could circle them, you could highlight them, but I make students identify and correct their own errors because they got to own it and they have to be able to fix it themselves. And this just teaches them to help themselves and to be a little more self-sufficient. And from everything that the Dean of Students has been telling us, that students need to learn self-sufficiency. And again here, this is where I was talking about those cover letters or reflective letters. You can do it with a final draft so that they've gone back to an initial draft and corrected errors, or you can use it for the second or third assignment where they're looking at earlier assignments and what you have graded and they have corrected them. So again, creating accountability, my favorite thing. So that is the end of this slideshow or this presentation. Hopefully this was not as boring as talking about lecturing students about documentation. I will be linking in, the library is getting ready to put live a new documentation LibGuide. I've seen a preview of it and it is fabulous. So I will be linking that to this unit as soon as I possibly can. I'm happy to help you if you have any questions. I would highly recommend partnering with the librarians. They are wonderful people. They know a lot about hands-on activities with students, with correct documentation, all of that fun stuff. So you may be required to go to the library because you're in an IL class, but even if you're not in a writing intensive class, they would love to see you. And so it's very easy to get them to take your class over there, or if you just want them to come to your class for 15 minutes, they're happy to do that. So I think it's great that our colleagues are here to support us. And it's also a lot of fun not to be the only instructor in the room. So that is all. Thank you for your attention and thank you for everything that you do for our students.